Thanks for joining us. My name is Marie Morrison. I am the Director of Built for Zero Canada, and very excited to have Hamilton presenting today on how they are operationalizing prioritization, how they are building in Indigenous partnerships and practices in that regard, and how they've been developing that and rolling it out. So a big thank you to our presenters today for joining us.
Marie, we're not seeing your slides, just so you know, before you keep going.
You know what? That is super helpful. Let's do this then. Thanks for that, Ashley. Can you see it now?
We can. We're just seeing the presenter mode. So if you switch the modes, we're good to go.
There.
Perfect.
Okay. So again, thank you everyone for joining us for this by name listing coordinated access community practice call to learn about Hamilton's experience, their wins and pitfalls, and how they're incorporating Indigenous prioritization into both the Indigenous and mainstream systems, along with the overall rollout of their new prioritization criteria. Want to start with a land acknowledgement. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. I encourage you to put your own land acknowledgement in the chat. I am located in Kitchener, Ontario, which is situated on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Neutral peoples, whose presence on these lands continue to this day. Just some very quick housekeeping. These community practice calls are hosted by the Canadian Alliance with funding from the Government of Canada, Reaching Home. We are, of course, recording the presentation. It will be sent out to all those who registered and posted on the Training and Technical Assistance website. We have enabled closed captioning, so you can choose to select to view that or not. Everyone is muted, and we encourage you to use the chat and the question function to make comments and ask questions throughout. And I am your host today, along with Ashley Vandermark. I'll just get her to wave. She's the Improvement Advisor for Hamilton and will be co-hosting along with me. We have three wonderful presenters, and we want to move into the presentation fairly quickly because unfortunately Victoria Bomberry can only join us for the first 25 minutes or so, but she will be collecting any questions that you might have for her for follow-up and inclusion in the PowerPoint afterwards. So Victoria Bomberry is Mohawk Six Nations of the Grand River, and she leads the data and policy analysis work for the Coalition of Hamilton Indigenous Leadership, or CHIL, an Indigenous health geographer by training. Victoria has worked at the local and national level to address the unique needs of Indigenous peoples experiencing homelessness in urban settings. We also have Ariana King, who's the social policy analyst lead for coordinated access at the City of Hamilton. She's been there since 2018. She has a background in the areas of law, adult education, and public administration, with a special interest in human services. And she's also done some work at the provincial level, and she's feeling fortunate to be working in the area of homelessness. And then we have Vanessa Parlet, who's the Senior Project Manager for Coordinated Access and Reaching Home implementation through the City of Hamilton. She brings more than 15 years of experience working across the community and government sectors, collaboratively leading evidence-based and community-driven transformative change by working with and for those most impacted. So a huge welcome to our three speakers. Again, thank you for being here. And in the interest of time, with no further ado, I am going to turn it over to your presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Marie, and thank you everyone for joining us. We're so thrilled to be part of this learning community and to have the opportunity today to share some of the work we're doing between the City of Hamilton and the Coalition for Hamilton Indigenous Leadership, known as CHIL, to build out our community's coordinated access system. And so that today we'll focus on our most recent work in operationalizing our shared community prioritization processes. Next slide. I think Ariana was going to do this part.
Yes, thanks, Vanessa. So it's my responsibility to begin today by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation and the Haudenosaunee Nations. These lands are covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee nations, which called to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, the meeting place of Hamilton is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work in this territory. Land acknowledgements remind us of the violent disruption of Indigenous ways of knowing and being on these lands. That these injustices and inequities persist to this day invites us to consider our role in addressing the displacement, dispossession, and disempowerment of Indigenous peoples in our work and our communities. Thank you.
Next slide, please. So part of the reason we're here today and sharing what's happening in Hamilton and what you may be seeing in your communities as well is the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples experiencing homelessness in our community. Among Hamilton's general population, only 2% of community members identify as Indigenous or having Indigenous ancestry. However, when we look at our by name list of community members experiencing homelessness that we know of, the proportion of those who identify as Indigenous or having Indigenous ancestry jumps from 2% to 11%. And when we look again at our most recent point in time survey results, the proportion of community members experiencing homelessness who also identify as Indigenous or having Indigenous ancestry jumps again to 23%. And while there are strengths and weaknesses to any census or survey, what we have consistently recognized in our community is that when this work is done by Indigenous peoples for Indigenous peoples, our community members are more comfortable sharing their stories. This is part of why Indigenous leadership for Hamilton is not just about participation, but leadership, and it's critical to the work we do. We cannot solve the problems that we cannot see. When Indigenous community members see Indigenous leadership throughout our system, they are more likely to trust that the work is informed by an awareness that our Indigenous community members experiencing homelessness at higher rates is due to historical and ongoing policies that seek to disempower, displace, and disadvantage Indigenous peoples. Next slide, please.
And so as a homeless serving sector, we recognize Indigenous homelessness as a colonial legacy, and this drives all of the action that we take together. We honor the Indigenous definition of homelessness, and in doing so recognize that any person who identifies as Indigenous has significantly greater housing barriers due to systemic discrimination that is underpinned by historical and ongoing colonial practices. We recognize Indigenous people face disproportionate rates of poverty, homelessness, and housing insecurity, and have experienced negative impacts of policy decisions by all levels of government that have resulted in a long history of problematic outcomes and barriers. So from this perspective, it's imperative that all of our work seek to remove as many administrative, financial, and infrastructure barriers as possible to support Indigenous peoples, both in non-Indigenous service streams and in ensuring access to Indigenous-led programs, supports, and policies. This grounds everything we do in our partnership between CHIL and the City of Hamilton as we work to build an equitable, inclusive, and transparent coordinated access system that is grounded in and supportive of Indigenous knowledge, leadership, and self-determination. Next slide. And so for our community, answering these calls to action means recognizing the disparity of resources and capacity. This speaks to why it's so important to not only collaborate, but to do so in a way that empowers our Indigenous communities to lead. And a lot more of those details are coming up in the next slide. But first, in looking from a resource capacity, as designated community entity and service system manager, the City of Hamilton is accountable to ensuring that Hamilton meets all of our federal and provincial homelessness strategy objectives. This includes implementation of a coordinated access system in collaboration with CHIL, management of a by name list of those known to be experiencing homelessness, the system-wide use of a homelessness management information system, and the stewardship, administration, and coordination of diverse streams of funding to ensure a comprehensive housing first approach to ending homelessness. Ariana and I sit on the Homeless Policy and Programs team, and we engage in this work alongside our colleagues in the rest of the Housing Services Division. This together achieves towards our broader housing and homelessness action plan to ensure that everyone in Hamilton has a home. Within our homelessness policy portfolio, alone we're working with dozens of community agencies through more than 138 contracts with more than 26 million per year in annual funding. To manage this ever-expanding work and responsibilities to our sector, we have a team of 12 full-time staff, with Ariana and I primarily dedicated to building and evolving our coordinated access system. And we're also grateful that we're able to benefit from broader city resources. This includes legal analysis, communications and graphic design, as well as IT support. And IT support is really essential to our ability to host HITIS on our city IT servers. Next, I'll turn to Victoria to outline some of CHILL's work.
Thanks, Vanessa. So yes, when we're looking at the resources and capacity differences between the two community entities for Hamilton, we recognize how important our relationship is. CHILL works at with a fraction of the resources and capacity. We have 4 full-time staff, but not everyone is dedicated to homelessness and the coordinated access system. We leverage our partnerships and the historic relationships we've had being a community leader over the last 20 plus years. And when we're looking to develop coordinated access and we don't have the in-house capacity or expertise, we're fortunate to be able to collaborate with the National Indigenous Homelessness Council, which recently incorporated and has a number of Indigenous leaders from across these lands that can support our work. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Victoria. So to speak to the Indigenous community entity and the designated community entity collaboration, I'm going to start off and then I'll turn it over to Victoria. So our current partnership with the 3 of us did not begin there, although we're honored to continue building this work forward together. There is a long-standing history of dedicated relationship building and collaboration that has laid the path for the work that we're doing today. The roots of this long-standing relationship are often traced back to 2004, where the Indigenous community represented by CHILL and formerly HEDEC, the Hamilton Community Advisory Board, and the city as the community entity decided that 20% of the designated community stream of funding would be allocated to the Indigenous community. That 20% allocation has remained in place through subsequent iterations of the federal homelessness funding and extended to all funding, including provincial and municipal resources. Since 2009, funding for Aboriginal specific programs through the formerly known Homelessness Partnering Strategy Stream, HPS, were allocated through a process led by the Hamilton Executive Directors Aboriginal Coalition, or HEDEC. And I'll turn it over to Victoria for some more information on that.
Thanks, Ariana. So today and for the last several years, we work as partners in a relationship that is funder to funder, leading and directing our homelessness serving system and investments. Sorry, we're still on the last slide. CHILL serves as the Indigenous community entity for Reaching Home, the federal homelessness strategy, and brings our community knowledge and needs to the planning programs, strategies, and policy development. The City of Hamilton acts as the designated community entity and service manager. As the Indigenous community entity, CHILL, we receive separate funding. We have separate reporting requirements and again, report to the funding directives of the federal government. We have our own Indigenous Community Advisory Board that informs the strategies and the priorities of our community. We have responsibility for decisions and oversight of investments of Indigenous-led solutions through both streams. And again, the city and CHILL works together as funder to funder, where we see the city intentionally prioritizing the collaborative work with our leadership team in all aspects of the homelessness strategy and policy. This includes collaboration in development of the coordinated access system for Hamilton, which includes governance, policies, practices to ensure Indigenous peoples are prioritized throughout the system. Next slide, please.
Together, the city and CHIL are building the structures and relationships to harness our shared efforts as a sector to build a system where we are able to quickly identify and engage people at risk of and experiencing homelessness, to intervene quickly to prevent the loss of housing and divert people from entering the housing crisis response system. When homelessness does occur, that we're able to provide immediate access to shelter and crisis services without barriers to entry while working on permanent stable housing and appropriate supports, and to quickly connect people to housing assistance and services tailored to their unique needs and strengths, with particular attention on getting Indigenous people connected to the right range of supports that are culturally safe and supportive. The work we are doing to build an equitable and transparent system is the way that we are able to advocate for all individuals experiencing homelessness in our community. This is done through standardized policies, processes, and the system insights generated that allow us to identify and mobilize around emerging needs and gaps. This supports our collective work of all staff and programs working to end the experience of homelessness with each individual. And together, all of these individual journeys roll up into our response as a system. Next slide. And so to progress to the next level of our coordinated access system, in November of 2021, we embarked on 90 days of action as a homeless serving sector. The goal was to establish the processes and the resources needed to bring our system to a higher level of integration as we refocus combined efforts to our goal of getting people into long-term housing. This has been an opportunity to shift from the firefighting mode of pandemic emergency response to begin building out an enhanced model for how our sector will function through deeper integration going forward. We've had a long history of a strong foundation with common assessment, and now we're moving to that deeper place where we're able to support coordinated exits from homelessness and to harmonize the knowledge and practices between Indigenous and non-Indigenous programs. Through the 90 days of action, we set up 3 challenges. One was a common assessment challenge, really building on that foundation to learn as much as possible about people, their needs, their preferences, and their housing goals. We used this towards informing a matching challenge with our new prioritization processes that we're going to talk about as a way to get people connected to the right supports. And from that, we expect that it will drive towards housing solutions. So we have that for February, but it's really our ongoing work to get people connected and to celebrate those successes and the new partnerships to bring that to fruition. Next slide.
Thanks, Vanessa. So I know everyone here is familiar with these core components of coordinated access, so I'm not really going to dwell long here other than to speak to where we are in our journey. So Hamilton had started developing a coordinated access system back in 2016, which was building on decades of collaboration to establish coordinated entry, triage, and assessment, as well as implementation and expansion of HIFIS. Although we have had a quality by name list for a few years now, we haven't been able to fully employ its full potential and value. Previously, agencies regularly received the by name list, though did not have guidance on how to filter that list to connect people who can most benefit from their programs. To put it into perspective, we currently, as of today, have about 1,700 people active on our by name list. We are now moving to the next stage of coordinated access, where we apply shared community prioritization criteria to match people from a smaller by name priority list to the right level of housing supports. We launched this process through case conferencing in December, building on criteria developed through engagement with sector leaders over the past 2 to 3 years. Our goal over the 3.5-month testing phase was to build clear, transparent, and equitable processes that move people from homelessness to housing. Ongoing monitoring of this process will allow us to keep track of those who are on the by name list and not being reached. And we'll get into more detail in the upcoming slides. Next slide, please. So in terms of testing our prioritization model, there were a few key things here that I'll speak to from the non-Indigenous stream first, and then turn it over to Victoria. So from mid-December through to March, we were testing not only our prioritization criteria in order to build a binding priority list, but we were also testing case conferencing itself as a mechanism to facilitate prioritization and the matching to programs. So the bi-weekly case conferencing table has really been a core place for us to work through this model in practice with frontline staff, to address any limitations and refine it based on our learnings. And I'll turn it over to Victoria to elaborate.
Thanks, Ariana. So from the Indigenous community perspective, this table was incredibly important to ensuring that our Indigenous frontline workers, as well as Indigenous policy leaders such as myself, were a part of these conversations to help negotiate and understand the different experiences and needs of Indigenous community members. As Ariana and Vanessa mentioned earlier, looking at how to make sure that our coordinated access policies are equitable includes looking back at some of the tools that we're using, and not only respecting the experiences of Indigenous community members experiencing homelessness, but also responding and ensuring that our policies and practices reflect the unique needs of Indigenous community members. And one of those ways that we have been working on quite closely with the City of Hamilton is in developing an alternative assessment tool to better understand the needs and experiences, the housing needs and homelessness experiences of Indigenous community members by developing a separate tool that is informed by our Indigenous community members experiencing homelessness, our Indigenous frontline workers, and of course, our Indigenous leadership as well. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Victoria. So this is a blank sample of the legend for our binding priority list. It's cut off to make it legible, but we have the same categories for non-Indigenous clients. And this amounts to a priority list that is essentially 18 mini lists to refer people to the specific types of program resources best suited to their needs. So you can see that we have grouped people according to those that we think would benefit most from intensive case management, who typically would have a higher level of acuity, those that we think would benefit most from rapid rehousing, which is typically a mid-level of acuity, and those that we think would benefit from ongoing support through shelter and outreach case management, and or might be matched to housing units that don't have any supports on place. So we did have some of those types of resources available during the testing period. For each of these, so this first half of the list is for Indigenous people well suited to each of those types of programs. We have the same groupings for non-Indigenous. And then within each of those groupings, you see long stayers, short stayers, and unsheltered. So long stayers would be people in the system for 6 months or more. Short stayers would be those for less than 6 months. And then unsheltered is, of course, those who are currently living outside or in an encampment. So the intention of this is to make sure that we're not inadvertently missing people from the priority list, that there's a diversity of caseloads, and that we're also having a dedicated attention to those who are unsheltered. Along with this, we also do have a clause in our prioritization policy for urgent health and safety needs, which is another way to bring forward people who may not be known to the system, which is often the case for Indigenous clients or women who might be experiencing hidden homelessness, and also for accounting for people that have an urgent health and safety risk that would require them to go ahead of the community prioritization criteria. Next slide. And so through our 3-month trial of this new process, we were testing both the prioritization criteria and case conferencing. These are the results of case conferencing over the course of 6 sessions with each of the subsectors for men's, women's, families, and youth. So collectively across all 4 of them and the 6 sessions between them, we have been able to discuss and make a plan for 401 households. The number already housed and already on caseload show that our system is largely working with the right people, which is those with the greatest need and potential to benefit from available resources. And we've also been able to newly assign 75 people to caseload. Additionally, people marked as having contact or details pending were typically added to caseload if still seeking service. And then you see at the bottom, the number housed since the last case conference are usually people discussed at case conference and housed within a month. So we still need to do a full review of everyone discussed at case conference to cross-reference to see who's been housed over a longer duration. So that's likely to be an undercount. We've more recently uncovered a really exciting discovery in these findings, where we see that 188 Indigenous clients have been discussed across the 6 rounds of case conferencing. This makes up 47% of the total. And it also means that we've discussed all Indigenous clients or those who identified as Indigenous on our current by name list. So in March, we had 191 Indigenous people on the list. 12 of these were dependent children. So that leaves us with 179 adults who have been brought forward, plus 213 non-Indigenous people. So this is a really important way that we've honored the commitment to prioritizing Indigenous people first, while also meeting the equitable needs of supporting our whole population. Outside of these numbers, we've also worked through operational issues as a sector. So through case conferencing, it's prompted review of how housing placements are being recorded in HIFIS with pending updates to policy. It's allowed for clarity among providers to spend approximately 1 month doing follow-up to attempt reaching out with people. And it's also been a unique opportunity for collaboration between Indigenous and non-Indigenous programs. And we'll get to a few more of those learnings in a moment. Next slide.
Thanks, Vanessa. So during this process, and certainly at the milestone of conclusion, it was very important for us to get participant feedback on the process and its perceived challenges and successes. So from what we can see here for the staff that were surveyed and participated in case conferencing, we do see that the majority of staff did see value in continuing case conferencing, with a big factor being the opportunity for collaboration across the sectors, and particularly with Indigenous partners. Some concerns that remain are still the process of generating the prioritization list. That still remains prevalent, and we're going to get into some more details on learnings about that in the next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So this undertaking really represented a major shift to existing referral practices, and we recognize it will require ongoing support for programs moving forward. Practically, what this meant in our system is that referral practices changed. So instead of direct referrals from staff in shelters, drop-ins, outreach, or other community sites, all referrals to Housing First programs will be facilitated through the coordinated access system via the by name priority list. So although Housing First programs have long been required to accept 100% of referrals from the by name list itself, we did not previously have a way to support them in how to prioritize intakes. We now have a by name priority list to facilitate the identification of a smaller list of people immediately eligible for each type of Housing First program. We did come across a couple of learnings. So some unanticipated issues with care coordination through the CE were experienced due to closing side doors in the community. Specifically, we also learned that the common assessment tool really doesn't tell the whole story. Sometimes it's seen as inaccurate, and consistently we see concerns raised that there are those who don't feel comfortable completing a VI SPDAT and may get missed. And we also have to honor and recognize that this particular series of tools is not reflective of the Indigenous experience. Another concern was that those not presenting at shelters might get missed. So this includes people who are being referred from outside sectors like the VAW health and justice system. Some actions that we've taken moving forward to mitigate those risks were to develop policies and criteria for urgent health and safety, as Vanessa mentioned, and for those who may have missing or inaccurate information. And we continue through outreach to build connections with other systems. And finally, we also did recognize through this process that there is a need for a complex care planning table to support those with higher levels of acuity that currently don't have existing resources in our community. I'll turn it over to Vanessa for some more information.
And so although we launched case conferencing with the purpose of prioritizing and matching people to specific resources, we've learned from staff that one of the primary benefits they see at case conference has been the collaboration aspect. And so really hearing how important it's been to have all of the partners come together to fill in client histories, the richness of experience that isn't captured in the database, to help fill in some of those details, and most importantly, to be able to locate people and build the connection from where they currently are. So really hearing so much value from that perspective. We could go, spend the full hour unpacking any of these areas of learning, but where we really wanted to spend most of our time is what we've learned and how to engage our Indigenous partners in embedding Indigenous prioritization within our system. So we'll go on to the next slide to delve in deeper there. Thanks, Marie. And so these are some of our core learnings and actions that we've taken to embed Indigenous knowledge and experience into our prioritization processes and coordinated access more broadly. We're of course still learning and figuring this out, and it's an ongoing journey and commitment from all partners, and really wanting to emphasize the intentionality in working through the challenges together. And one of the things we appreciate so much in our relationship with CHIL is that we're at a place where there's deep honesty and candor for when we're not quite getting it right, or there's something that we don't yet have a solution for, that we're able to sit in that discomfort together and sort of be called forward to take the next step. And did just want to acknowledge here that Victoria had to run out to a previous conflicting appointment, and so would of course normally speak to this. And just wanted to acknowledge that any questions that come forward, we'll make sure that we get Victoria's perspective to speak to that as well. So I'm going to do the best I can sharing some of this, but regret that Victoria couldn't add to this part of the conversation. And so did just want to note that, again, based on the definition of Indigenous homelessness, that we do recognize in Hamilton all Indigenous people to be experiencing chronic homelessness, and that we've committed that a minimum of 30% of all people prioritized through the by name priority list will be Indigenous. That was actually sometimes a challenge once we got through most of the Indigenous people on the list, that particularly in the youth and family sectors, there would sometimes not be 30% of all people on the list making up that proportion. So we would tend to overrepresent from other subsectors, and then of course got through all of those who are experiencing homelessness who have identified as Indigenous. So we'll continue to prioritize based on Indigenous identity and those who've identified as having Indigenous ancestry, while also knowing that there are many reasons why people might not disclose having Indigenous ancestry, and that the Indigenous Common Assessment that CHIL has been developing is seen as a really important way to creating the safe space for people to disclose and to have holistic conversations, as well as to get the information about their needs, strengths, and stories to help inform what types of programs will be best suited for them. One other point I wanted to draw out is that one of the aspects of collaboration has been really valuable in that our Indigenous partners are not currently using HIFIS, which means that outside of case conferencing, there isn't really an opportunity to coordinate between Indigenous and non-Indigenous programs. So that's created an opportunity through case conferencing to come together, identify who's working with who, and also clarify a core policy process in our community that Indigenous clients not be forced to choose between Indigenous and non-Indigenous programs, that it's essential that they be offered both, and that Indigenous programs can offer holistic cultural supports, while they may still also benefit from the supports offered through mainstream programs. Another piece that we're very proud of and deeply honored that our Indigenous partners have been so actively participating in this process and see enough value that they've adapted their consent forms to allow their participation within the homeless serving sector. Some work that we need to continue to do is related to building up Indigenous data stewardship practices more broadly in our community. And there was a proposal under the Innovation Fund with Reaching Home, which was not funded, and we're looking for ways to carry this forward for Indigenous data liaison role, as well as for building out a cultural competency framework. So those are pieces that aren't yet fully developed that we want to work towards together to take us to that next stage of collaboration. Next slide.
So in terms of our ongoing journey and the journey moving forward to embed Indigenous knowledge and experience into coordinated access, there are a couple of key challenges and a call to action really that we want to highlight. So the first challenge, we have to recognize the resource inequity, which is grounded in colonial systems and structures. So we are seeking to enhance and create sustainable funding resources through federal government and our municipal levy. And we have to be conscious in working relationships that the city does have greater staff capacity, and the pace and volume of our work is quite intense. So trying to find a balance in asks of our Indigenous partners and their time commitments, while also ensuring that CHIL and our partners have enough space to lead in our community. Second, identifying and supporting people with Indigenous ancestry who may not feel comfortable disclosing that ancestry to non-Indigenous service streams. So we know ongoing work is needed with non-Indigenous partners in how to ask about Indigenous ancestry and support Indigenous clients in a holistic way. So the Indigenous Common Assessment that Victoria previously spoke to and relationships built through prioritization case conferencing are helping to build avenues for those conversations and new practices to evolve. And finally, a commitment to building trust and shared understanding, which we see as critical. Ongoing investment in the relationship and in Indigenous-led solutions is paramount. It means walking the walk, even when it gets hard or the results don't align with the best of intentions. For example, an underutilization of housing allowances or stability benefits within Indigenous programs. We know putting in the effort to understand why, adjust how resources are set up or accessed, and use it as an opportunity to better understand and address the needs of the community. Also, there's another example that we've experienced, which is perceived duplication on caseloads when someone is accessing both non-Indigenous and Indigenous-led housing programs. So through case conferencing, we learned from Indigenous partners the importance that Indigenous people not be forced to choose between the two service streams. They may get holistic and culturally appropriate supports through Indigenous programs while still benefiting from services offered in non-Indigenous case management. So we're supportive of the call for collaboration rather than distinction. Next slide.
And so here we'd just like to open it up to any questions or comments. And again, wanted to acknowledge that with Victoria having been pulled away, that we'll capture any questions that are asked of us. Ariana and I will do the best to answer from the perspective of the city and then share those with Victoria so that she'll be able to provide a written response that will be sent out to participants after today.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for all that you shared. And I will just note a comment in here from Aaron, just very inspiring to see the commitment to addressing Indigenous homelessness and collaborating with local Indigenous peoples. Can't wait to share this information with my team. And I would echo that. We will push this out. I'm seeing that there's some people that I might have hoped would be on the call that aren't on the call. We'll make sure that this information is shared broadly. We do have a couple of questions here in the Q&A. Do you assess or prioritize youth differently than adults?
Great question. Vanessa, I can take a first jump in and then call on you. So as we mentioned in the presentation, we do separate out the 4 sectors and prioritize within it. We did discover there are some unique needs of youth compared to the adult system. So as an example, typically for age, we would do descending order. Youth is ascending order, so focusing from youngest up to the age of 25. Vanessa, anything else you want to add there?
And then just to say that there's particular attention both with the younger youth and then transitionally aged youth, where they might come up in both the youth system and the adult system, so that they're offered the ability to choose which type of support would be most suitable. And we are also working with our youth sector partners to address some of the gaps in the youth system. So imagining that coordinating access for youth may evolve over the coming months as we refine that criteria.
Wonderful. And then what factors do you consider when prioritizing the by name list for available housing and service opportunities?
Yeah, so it's a very complex process, and I'm not sure if she's on the call, but our program analyst, Laura Stanford, is doing amazing work building from our previous program analyst, Robin Perry, to establish the by name list and filter against the criteria that's been established by our community. So the first priority criteria is Indigenous status. So as we said, all people experiencing homelessness who identify as Indigenous are considered to be chronically homeless and included within that, whether they have a VI-SPDAT completed or not. The second criteria is chronicity. So those experiencing chronic homelessness of 6 months or more. We also then look at acuity as the next way to filter, and that doesn't bar people from services, but that's how we group people into the range of supports that we think would be best suited to them. So that's where we say those with an 8 to 12 on the VI-SPDAT or a higher level of acuity would be directed towards ICM as a first consideration, or intensive case management. Those with a mid-level of 4 to 7 would be directed to rapid rehousing or potentially transitional living type programs. And then those with lower acuity, we would expect would benefit from early intervention supports and shelter case management, and likely wouldn't be referred to intensive case management. And then also we have, through the last 3 months, had some dedicated housing units available, both for people with a low level of acuity, as well as some supportive housing for people with a mid-level of acuity, which we've been able to prioritize through the same process. So really just thinking about the type of support that we have available and then matching people up based on what we know about their situation and their level of need.
That's great.
Anything to add there, Ariana?
No, I think just to mention that we recognize it's not a perfect process. And as we mentioned in the presentation, we did create a standalone policy that recognized and honored flexibility through this process, which is the urgent health and safety. So for instance, if there was a pregnant woman, the considerations we would use there are, the level of urgency and the level of need in relation to time, and considering from the perspective of if permanent supportive housing would serve to stabilize and mitigate high risks related to the health and safety considerations. So for people like that, we've developed a process where they can be put forward beyond anyone that we have on the list through the criteria that Vanessa mentioned.
So Ariana, because there is a question about this, so you've talked a little bit about it. So it just sort of brings the name forward. And then is it considered just sort of in the conversation at the table, or where does it go from there?
Yeah, so we do have a separate process where 2 members of the team will review based on a definition that we've created for urgent health and safety within broader definitions and best practice of homelessness, and have to consider from the perspective of if permanent housing will solve or reduce the risk of urgent health and safety needs. So we recognize anyone who's experiencing homelessness, there is an urgent health and safety need. So how do we really consider who's above and beyond that? And through that process, we consider things like comorbidity, terminal illness, pregnancy. And from there, we've also developed, like I said, a process for how that gets determined. And then we go back. So that's not brought forward to the case conferencing table currently. That's done, reviewed by management, and then sent back to the program, and the client would be notified.
Okay, thank you. And if you don't have any housing vacancies or opportunities available when you gather for case conferencing, do you still meet for case conferencing?
Yeah, great question. Vanessa, you want to take a first shot?
So this is a great question. And currently, so we're using case conferencing to allocate the resources that we do have available, which right now, for the most part, is case management support. So intensive case management and rapid rehousing. Although we have had, and so that would be vacancies available on those caseloads. And then we have had 10 or 11 units of supportive housing and 2 units of housing without supports that we've allocated through the same process, one to the men's sector, one to the women's. And so we have fortunately had space on all caseloads during this time to be able to bring forward the bi-weekly case conferencing until recently with the family sector. So in Hamilton, we're currently experiencing a lot of pressure in the family system where the family shelters are full, there's no space available, and also the caseloads are full as well. So we did take a week rather than discuss new cases when we didn't actually have a resource available to offer. We spent more time doing status updates on those previously discussed to get a better understanding of whether the supports offered to them are meeting their needs, and also learn through that process that 10 families have been housed since December. So all the more reason why we'd like to go back and do those updates more regularly. But that is something that we're looking at, that if we don't actually have space on caseloads or other resources to offer, that we would cancel the meeting or use it for another purpose if there is a different, wanting to collaborate around a new resource or do some updates.
Great. I have a question here. How did you engage those with lived experience in the development of coordinated access in Hamilton, and how are frontline workers continuing to be involved?
That's a really important question too, and work that continues to evolve in our community. So, we are very fortunate in Hamilton to have 3 bodies that are arm's length to the city that really engage the sector deeply and provide a lot of leadership that informs our work. These are the Women's Homelessness Planning Committee, the Street Youth Planning Committee, as well as the Men's Emergency Service Committee. And the Women's Committee and the Youth Committee both have tables of people with lived experience that contribute and inform our work that way. We also do have lived experience on our Community Advisory Board, which has contributed to building our community plan. And then through our frontline staff are definitely staying in touch with what we're learning and seeing on the ground. But we do have efforts underway for 2022 to more deliberately build in, structures for leadership for people with lived experience, which was a bit more difficult during the pandemic, but just wanting to figure out what that model looks like for us. So working very closely with our partners to do that. And then in terms of the frontline perspective, just wanted to add how valuable it's been for us as well in terms of the collaboration aspect at case conferencing, where we do have so many frontline providers coming forward, taking cases, problem solving together. So we're learning a lot more about what's happening in programs and seeing the work firsthand. So it's really building a greater understanding of our sector and how we can work together.
Wonderful. And a question about who is case management and rapid rehousing provided by in your community?
Yes, so we initiated a call for applications in 2019 for reaching home funded programs, specifically in the areas of intensive case management, rapid rehousing, transitional living programs, diversion, and a variety of prevention programs as well, and outreach, of course. So through that, case management is conducted from the successful applicants through that process. So it is a variety of organizations within our community that have the funded contracts awarded to them that continue to work very closely with us to do that work.
Wonderful. And a question just sort of logistically in how you are identifying Indigenous people and prioritizing them if they're not on your by name list. Is this solely done through case conferencing? And then do the Indigenous organizations prioritize their clients and then submit a short list? So is there a separate sort of prioritization process that happens through the Indigenous groups before you're coming to case conferencing?
So currently our Indigenous providers have a lot of autonomy over how they prioritize an intake to their services. We're very grateful that some of the core Indigenous partners in our community have participated so actively in case conferencing. So we haven't actually been prioritizing Indigenous clients that have become known only through those programs, mostly because there have been sufficient numbers on the by name list of people that are known that have not yet been connected to program, that we have spent most of our time focusing there. And then often if some of the Indigenous providers in the community know about clients, often they may already be working with them, but certainly through this urgent health and safety policy, which also incorporates those that are not yet known to the system, that's an avenue to share people, particularly Indigenous people who are not on HIFIS, not on the BNL, that might not be known to the system, but would certainly be able to benefit from the supports on offer.
And we should probably note, as a community through this process, we also consider anyone who identifies with Indigenous ancestry, and that does include non-status Indigenous peoples.
Wonderful. And a question here just around being able to track homeless deaths. You had some data in one of your tables about the number of folks who had died, and so folks were just wondering how you were tracking that.
Yeah, there are ongoing conversations with our public health department within the city. It's not a very straightforward way to track deaths resulting from the experience of homelessness. We do endeavor and want to certainly honor and memorialize, most importantly, any member of our community who has lost their life. That is very important to us, but the ways in which we collect that, articulate that, and document it are very sensitive and complex. So those conversations are continuing to evolve at a senior level currently.
People are asking for, is it going to be possible to access any examples of some of your policies?
Ooh, Vanessa, do you want to share the good news?
Yeah, so we are very excited that we're at the tail end of preparing our whole policy package to go up online. Takes a bit of time to do the web design, so probably by the end of April. And so they're just undergoing final review by our Coordinated Access Steering Committee, made up of the leaders of all of the funded agencies that we're working with. And so they'll all be ready very shortly, within the next few weeks to month.
That is very exciting. And certainly if you're sharing them publicly, we'd be happy to put them on the website so folks can access them as well. Ashley, I'm going to let you ask your typical question that you are so great for asking at the end of a presentation. So I'll let you go ahead.
I guess I'm just that predictable, am I? First of all, thank you, Vanessa, Ariana, and Victoria for this presentation. This has just been so great. from myself, I can see the comments. People are just so excited to hear from you and the work that you're doing, and how intentional that you're being in that work. And I think my final question is always about learnings. What would you, if there was 3 key messages or 1 key message that you would want folks to walk away with, what would that be? But I'd also love to add something on that. If there are communities on the call right now who are just embarking on this journey, in both veins, whether it be around improving their coordinated access system, but also starting to engage in conversations with Indigenous partners that they may have in the community, or if they're not really sure if they have any, what would you tell those communities as they're starting to engage in that work?
Yeah, so I can certainly kick it off with 2 learnings for myself. With regards to Indigenous partnerships as a non-Indigenous entity, it's okay for it to be uncomfortable. And walking the walk and truly being committed to reconciliation does involve a great deal of discomfort sometimes. And that's okay, to be honest, and continue to do that work. There does need to be a little bit of discomfort, so don't be afraid of it. Don't be afraid to have the conversations. Don't be afraid to hear the hard messaging, because it's critical to underpinning and building relationships of trust. Secondly, for overall learnings for coordinated access, I would say that the administrative work is advocacy work in and of itself. So taking the time to build policies, to build frameworks, strategies, quality data, that is a form of advocacy. And I think it's important to remember that kind of advocacy serves to support everybody who's experiencing homelessness. So although individual work at a frontline level is also critical and so important, so is the administrative piece to make sure this all works equitably and transparently as a system. Vanessa?
Yeah, I think it's just, translating that vision into practical implementation. And so really wanting to anticipate from the outset what some of those challenges are. So one of the things that we envisioned at the beginning when we were preparing in November to launch case conferencing, at the time there were 143 people on the by name list who had identified as Indigenous. And we thought, oh, if we truly honor our priority criteria to start with Indigenous, we'll never get to non-Indigenous people on the list. And so that's where we came up with the 30% minimum proportion. So just being able to anticipate that, problem solve around it with CHIL, and then in the end, actually talked about all Indigenous people on the list, as well as 213 non-Indigenous. And so just, really thinking through all those scenarios at the beginning and building on what Ariana said, really doing this in deep collaboration means that everything we do with CHIL. So any policy we're putting out, any big decision, new partnerships, reports that we're preparing for council, all of that we get CHIL's advice and direction on, and so valuable for the insights that they bring. And also doing that in a way conscious of the resource imbalance, knowing that we have more staff, we have sort of different accountabilities to move at a certain pace with the federal, provincial government and our own council. So really trying to do that in a way that supports Indigenous leadership without putting undue burden on them. So we're constantly kind of finding our way through that balance and that relationship, and really grateful for the guidance that we received through CHIL, both on sort of the practical aspects and structuring our ongoing partnership.
Wonderful. Well, that wraps our time, but a huge thank you again to Victoria and Vanessa and Ariana for preparing the presentation, presenting, answering questions. I'm just seeing tons of information in the chat, like thank you, great job, Hamilton, like just really appreciative. So again, we'll be putting this up on the website. We'll be sending it out to all those who registered, and we hope that you have a good rest of your week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thanks so much, everyone.